Please give your undivided attention and give a warm welcome to Dr. Smiler. We're excited to have him in Houston, and we're excited for him to be here at this conference. Thank you.
Thank you all for that warm welcome. Thank you all for inviting me here. It's quite an honor to get a stage like this. It doesn't happen often, and apparently as some of the conversation reflected yesterday, while there is some interest in males as part of sexuality, being about half the population, we don't seem to know as much. We often don't spend time or spend as much time talking about guys and what things are like from their perspective. So I'm going to do some of that. I'm going to be a little redundant here to start. This is a conference on sexual health. As you all know, hopefully know by this point, sexual health is about more than just disease and pregnancy or the absence of disease and pregnancy. And also it's about more than just reproductive health. If anyone has suggestions for a picture for reproductive health that is not a pregnant woman, perhaps something with a guy, please let me know. Because I'm pretty sure I can't do a picture of a prostate exam. I don't think that's going to work. But we want more than reproductive health. As we talk about sexual health, and again, as you all know from talking yesterday, we talk about a variety of behaviors. From kissing, we might say, all the way through penetrative sex, although there's nothing that says that it needs to go in that order or that kind of sequence. We can include masturbation. But we often talk about, or perhaps we should often talk about, pleasure. Part of the goal of all of this is indeed pleasure. We talk about relationships and a variety of aspects of relationships, including consent, which apparently was part of the conversation yesterday, intimacy, whether that be emotional intimacy or back to physical intimacy with some of the behaviors, respect and honesty, some individual level or personal factors like knowledge and values and belief, as well as issues related to reproduction and disease. And then we talk about guys. And this is kind of our image of male sexuality. This is 40 years of primetime TV on screen. These characters and the shows they come from were all major hits. All of these shows ran for at least 5 years. Actually, Martin ran for 5 years. Everything else was 7 or more. They all won an Emmy at least once for Best Show. Poor Martin, again, gets left out. All of the actors, except Martin Lawrence, won an Emmy for Best Lead Actor in a Comedy, except Neil Patrick Harris. He's actually Best Supporting Actor. Martin does get love from the BET Heritage folks. They do appreciate his work, and he won awards there, but not from the formal Emmy organization. As far as I can tell, or let me back that up a second, all of these guys are good guys. These are male characters that we liked, who we perhaps aspired to as young boys. I grew up with Fonzie, the epitome of cool. Prior to Arthur Fonzarelli and Hawkeye Pierce on MASH, as far as I can tell, there were no male leads on TV who were promiscuous and who were good guys. Prior to about 1970, as far as I can tell, if there was a popular show and it had a promiscuous male, that guy was a bad guy. You might imagine some of our soap operas there to fill in some of those gaps. But that changed about 40, 45 years ago. And all of a sudden we have good guys, guys that we like, who are promiscuous, and we start to accept that. This image, which in many ways has become our common conception of male sexuality, we might talk about it as a stereotype as well, not just an image, tells us that guys want sex. Anywhere, anywhen, anywho. We apparently are not very picky. This image tells us that guys want sex. They don't want relationships, and perhaps in some cases are actively working to avoid relationships. And we've come to believe over the last 40 years or so that this image, or this stereotype, or this Casanova complex, as I like to call it, describes most, if not all, teenage boys and men. This has become our default conception of male sexuality. And you can never really start selling this image too early. That's a baby bib on the left, and a onesie. And I'll have a small collection of photos like this. My daughter's 5. Opened up whole new parts of stores that I'd never walked into before. This notion that guys just want sex probably explains why about half of guys say they ever had the talk with their parents. And why most of the guys who had the talk tell us that it consisted of the 3 don'ts. Don't get a disease, don't get anyone pregnant, and for God's sake, just don't have sex. That conversation usually lasts less than 10 minutes. But if you think that guys are only interested in sex, then that's kind of all you would need to tell them. Don't do it. And if you're going to do it, make sure the bad stuff doesn't happen. Quote unquote, bad stuff doesn't happen. That image of male sexuality, the stereotype, is the version of male sexuality that appears most frequently in sexual education curricula. And particularly if you look at abstinence-only curricula, it's about the only image of male sexuality that shows up. This, in turn, between the stereotype, which is easily found in our culture, what parents do or really don't do as far as educating their kids, what sexual education do or really fail to do as far as educating our kids, kind of gives boys license to take risks when it comes to being sexual. And we know that boys are encouraged to take risks anyway. Just watch the Jackass movies. Right? It's all about taking dumb risks. And we have any number of other movies that show teenage boys doing those same kinds of dumb risk-taking. This, and I'm preaching to the choir here, this in turn contributes to our national rates of unplanned pregnancy, of sexually transmitted teens with sexually transmitted infections. And as you all probably know, when it comes to those two things, we are way ahead of any country that we want to compare ourselves to. We have a much higher percentage of teens with STIs and teens who become parents than any other country that we want to compare ourselves to, like Canada or Europe or any of those folks. The idea that boys just want sex and that they're all out screwing around does not actually reflect reality. I like to talk about the 25-15-5 pattern of partners. If you look at surveys with undergraduate young men, 18 to 19-year-olds, living on a college campus, minimal supervision, basically just making sure that they don't end up in the ER or burn the place down. Lots of young women there. Almost everybody in that age group is not married. And you ask them, how many sexual partners do you want to have in the next 30 days? About 25% of guys say they want 2 or more sexual partners in the next 30 days. 25%. David Buss and David Schmidt, and David Buss is here in Texas, have been doing this research now and asking that question for 20 years. And with American undergraduate students, consistently 25% of young males say they want 2 or more partners in the next 30 days. So those are our guys who want to screw around. The other 75% want 0 or 1 partner in the next 30 days. Most guys aren't doing this. And on anonymous surveys, living away from home with access to all sorts of young women their age who are also not married, most guys say that they're not really interested in having multiple partners. If we then shift and we look at the number of folks who say they've had 3 or more partners in the last year, and we do this with this research with teens 16 and up, as well as young adults, say 18 to 25 or 18 to 29, we find 15%, maybe 20% of young men tell us that they have had 3 or more partners in the last year. Again, this is a small minority of guys, about 1 in 5 or 1 in 6. And then if we look at who's doing this year after year after year, 3 years in a row with 3 or more sexual partners, now we're down to 5% of young men. 1 guy in 20. The stereotype, this image that we have sold ourselves over the last 40 years, is not reflected in the data. The data very clearly show us that most guys aren't doing this and aren't interested in doing this. What most guys tell us they're doing, whether we're doing interviews with teens or surveys or whatnot, Most guys tell us that the vast majority of their sexual activity occurs in some kind of relationship context. It might be the early stages where we're kind of hooking up, and I'm kind of hooking up with the same person every week, and then we change our Facebook status to "it's complicated," and then we decide we're dating. It was so much easier when I was growing up. You just went on a date, and then you were dating. But again, the vast majority of guys, the vast majority of their sexual activity is in some kind of relationship context, even if they're not yet calling it dating. And certainly then, once they are calling it dating. Very few guys really doing that kind of classic hookup where they're finding someone they've never seen before, being sexual with them, and never seeing or talking to them again. So how do we create sexually healthy young men? Well, part of the answer, and my answer for the next little while, is that we need to give them a better toolbox. Because right now, we give them very little that helps them be sexually healthy in the way that we are defining sexually health. We're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about four aspects of, or four areas where we can give them better tools. I'm going to talk about relationships, feelings, consent, which I understand was a big conversation yesterday, at least for some of you, and then saying no, because guys have that as an option. We're going to start with relationships. First off, I'm going to step way back. Humans are a social species. We function in groups. We are inherently social. There's an argument out there that our sociality is part of what drove our brain development and helped give us language and refine all of this complex higher thought that we have. We know that humans who are left alone, whether it is by their choice or whether it is enforced in something like solitary confinement, suffer a broad variety of both physical ailments and mental health ailments. Being alone is not good for us as a species. And I don't mean like never coming out of your house and being online all the time. I mean truly not having contact with other humans. We are inherently social. Being in relationships of various types is a basic part of who we are. But then if we look at the groups that boys often find themselves in, and particularly the groups that boys often choose, traditionally male groups, whether that's something like ROTC or junior ROTC or scouting or athletic teams, we often see organizations that have a strict hierarchy. It's very clear who is in charge, who is second, and all the way down. And often in these groups, a guy's position is based on his ability. Whatever the relevant ability is, that's how he gets rank and that's how he gets position. And if he wants to move up, it's a matter of improving or helping other people get worse or they leave or whatever. It is based in some way on his ability, and there's a fairly clear hierarchy. You all know in middle school and high school, there's also a hierarchy. And part of that hierarchy is about how you do masculinity. If you're a jock or a prince, you're near the top. If you're a rebel or a tough guy, somewhere in the middle. And if you're a nerd, you will be at the bottom. So that hierarchy gets replicated in any number of places. When we think about boys' relationships and how they learn about relationships, we know that they learn some of this, of course, by doing. And again, they learn some of this from the media. If you look at the shows that teen boys watch, shows with high levels of male viewership, these are not necessarily shows that are marketed towards guys, we see a real emphasis on guys as buddies. They hang out with each other. They do stuff. They don't really talk about their friendship so much. Lots of hijinks. And that shows up in our movies as well. Doesn't matter if it's comedy or an action. Those male-male relationships that are central are really all about doing. They're not about talking about our relationship, checking in to see if, are we doing okay here? Or, you said something, and it really made me mad. Hard to imagine Vin Diesel in that conversation, isn't it? And this is what they learn about friendship. And one of the things that we know is that have some type of friendship is central to having an ongoing romantic relationship. That is not the same as being in a romantic relationship, but we know that a romantic relationship that will endure for any length of time is going to carry with it a lot of those same elements as friendship does. If we look at what boys learn about sexuality, again, we have our Casanovas, whether they're on TV or on the big screen. I put Roger Moore in there as James Bond, and then it dawned on me that I really like Sean Connery better, but I didn't go back and change it. Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr. from the Iron Man films, where his promiscuity is explicitly a part of the action and drives a lot of the bad stuff that happens. Sports media. We know that sports media are targeted primarily at males. We know that males are the primary audience. And we know that, well, there are women who appear in sports media. They primarily appear in sexually objectified ways. And again, the hierarchy where they are secondary. And sad to say, but here it is, 2015, and it is still true that if you're female and you want to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated, your odds are better if you're a model than if you're an athlete. The Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, incidentally, ups the number of copies printed anywhere from by 5 to 10, depending on the year and how big they think it's going to be. I have seen analyses that say that Sports Illustrated would not be a profitable magazine without that issue. And they've been doing that for 25 years now, so they know what they're doing. And then we get this other place where boys learn about sexual relationships called porn. And here there really isn't any relationship. The relationships consist of something like, hey, you wanna? Which is not much as far as a relationship goes. We know that on surveys, about 25% of 14-year-old boys tell us that they look at porn somewhat regularly. And by somewhat regularly, we're talking about at least once a month. 14-year-old boys. For a generation that has grown up where nearly all of them have always had cable and they have never had rabbit ears, they don't differentiate between the broadcast networks of ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, the way that many of us in this room do. And they have kind of always been online with high-speed access, not dial-up. And it's just one more click over to porn. It is not necessarily its own separate entity the way that many of us in this room think about porn as a separate entity. It is just the last point on the continuum. And something like a quarter of our 14-year-olds are looking at porn once a month, they tell us on anonymous surveys. One of the interesting ways they get to porn is you have those 8 and 10-year-old boys with kind of potty humor and fart jokes and butt jokes. And at some point they say, oh, what happens when you search fart? And oh, what happens when you search butt? And when you search the word butt, you discover a whole new part of the internet. Seems fairly simple when you say it like that, but it's something that we as adults don't tend to think about what they're doing, because for many of us, going and searching online is kind of a separate activity. It's a different thing that we do, whereas for them, it is just part of how they have grown up. And it might be their first choice for lots of things. This is different from media that is geared towards or primarily has a female audience. These shows, and you'll notice that we're now in hour-long dramas if you recognize the cast from 90210 or Gilmore Girls or Pretty Little Liars. These shows are all about relationships. And while there is certainly some action on screen and we see folks doing stuff, there is also just a lot of people sitting and talking. And the relationships can get very, very, very complicated. The folks at MTV News thought that we needed some help understanding just who has kissed whom on Pretty Little Liars after 4 seasons. I'm not even going to try to make sense of that diagram. But this is part and parcel of what, quote unquote, the typical girl grows up with, as contrasted with the media that I just talked about regarding the typical boy. From their media, girls also get direction on friendship. These are screenshots from last week's Teen Vogue and last week's 17, an article in Teen Vogue on 21 ways to know someone is your best friend. Pretty sure that Sports Illustrated and ESPN aren't running this article. From 17, 10 Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants friendship lessons every girl needs in her life. Excuse me. Again, I'm pretty sure there's no parallel article for boys out there. I know there really isn't a good parallel movie for Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants. Fabulous book, too. We have this new word last 5 years or so, frenemies. I think it is not accidental that this movie that I was unaware of called Frenemies, which I think might have been a straight-to-video movie, has 2 women on the cover and not 2 men. There's also a one-year TV series called Frenemies, and I noticed the cover image for that was also 2 women and not 2 men. I think that is not accidental. I think the notion that 2 guys could go from being friends to enemies and then maybe back to friends again is kind of mind-boggling. Although we do see that switch from friends to enemies in a lot of superhero movies, but not back again so much. The result, or part of the outcome of this kind of training, is that the typical boy, by the time he hits the teen years, has a fairly kind of simple's not the right word, maybe simplistic, understanding of what friendship looks like and how friendship works, and a fairly simplistic understanding of what a romantic relationship looks like and how that works. In the blue, of course. Girls, and again, the so-called quote-unquote typical girl, by the time she's hitting her teen years, has a much more complicated, nuanced framework for understanding both friendship and romantic relationships. And especially if we're thinking about heterosexual couples, they're coming into a romantic relationship with unequal levels of knowledge, possibly unequal levels of experience, as far as how this is going to work and what it might look like. One of the other things that happens is that boys, again, having this relatively simpler framework, and for many boys, having grown up playing lots of games, whether those are board games or video games, having grown up watching, if not playing sports, are very bound by the rules. You know that the rules can be changed, but you can't change the rules during the game. We're going to play Monopoly this way, this time, and then we can talk about like how the bank works, and we can change it up for next time. Or we can make rule changes from one season of a sport to another. You all know, I hope you all know by this point in your lives, that is not how the rules of relationship work. Within a relationship, whether we're talking about a friendship or a romantic relationship, the rules can be changed or renegotiated at any time. They are not static. But that's news to most boys. They don't understand that. They don't have a framework. Most boys don't have a framework for understanding how a relationship gets deeper or stronger, because that kind of change just isn't in what we have discussed for them or what we have shown them on TV. So these are some of the tools that boys are missing from their toolbox. We can do a better job of teaching them, and that teaching also includes cooperative tasks in cooperative groups, not necessarily hierarchical groups. Many of you in school settings might assign group work, but I know from my own minimalistic training as a teacher, we don't often teach people how to do group work, what it means to effectively work together as a team. We just say, okay, the 4 of you go do this, and let them figure out those relationships and how that's going to work. But we can teach them. There are lots of models out there. We can also teach them more about how relationships work so that they have a more detailed, more complex, more nuanced understanding of relationships, both friendship and romantic relationships. And we can also talk to them about feelings. And again, I'm going to step back and go big picture here for a second. Those of you who have had an intro psych course or some anatomy and physiology or something, at some point learned about the amygdala. It's part of the brain highlighted in kind of a reddish there. The amygdala is our primary processing center for emotion. Everybody has one. It is part of being human. We need to remind people that everybody has one, and this is part of the basic equipment of being human. It's part of the hardware that we are all born with. We all get it. I will also point out that, as you can see on the diagram, the amygdala is much closer to the brainstem, where the spine comes into the base of the brain. And it's below all of the cortical areas, the wiggly stuff at the top of the diagram that gives us higher thought and higher thinking. That's part of the reason why emotions can kind of hijack our system. And when we have strong feelings, our rational brain can't always break the pattern. Part of that is just structural. The amygdala and the emotional centers are much closer to some of those other basic functions. It's very hard for the brain for thought to, say, hijack emotion, but emotion can hijack thought, and part of that is really structural here. When we think about boys or men and emotions, we might think of something like this. We tend to see guys as fairly unemotional. Either they don't have their feelings or they don't show their feelings. You can take your pick. There are a few times when you are allowed to show feelings: weddings, funerals, if you're an adult, the birth of your child, regardless of who you are, when your team wins or loses the big game. Girls, on the other hand, and women, much more like this. And again, these two images, somewhat stereotypical, but also when we interview boys and men, girls and women, about their feelings, about what they recognize, what they express, when we give them surveys about how emotional they are, even on studies of emotional intelligence, we do see those differences when we just do the simple comparison of male versus female. Again, lots of exceptions. You all probably know some women who aren't particularly emotional, know some guys who really are drama kings, lots of exceptions, but at the gross level of group averages and our stereotypes, this is what we got. Over the last 40 years or so, we are seeing a slight change for men, from 6 to 9 perhaps on screen. Current generation of fathers compared to their fathers say and are trying to live up to this idea of being more emotionally involved and more emotionally connected with their kids and possibly even with their partners. And more so than their grandparents as well. So we are seeing some progression here. How much that is filtering down to our current day teens is unclear. It's harder to do those kinds of comparisons with the data. But at the same time, we also have this increasingly pervasive image of males as robots. Terminator, which is not in fact terminating, but is back on the big screen. And the Fox football robot. The Fox football robot, incidentally, gets bigger and broader each year. But, with the exception of a few scary movies, we tend to think of robots as unemotional. It is not what they do. They are logical processors. And being a robot, being a machine, is one of the ways that guys talk about each other. It is certainly part of the jargon. Being a machine is certainly a part of the jargon of the way that we talk about male athletes. If you're watching the basketball game last night, 2 nights ago, the announcers were talking about LeBron James as a machine because he just kept hitting jump shot after jump shot after jump shot. And that verbiage slips into our language. Machines are not emotional. Guys should not be emotional. being emotional is part of how we define, part of what we say is central to girls and women and femininity. And if there is one message that guys have gotten over and over very clearly for generations, it's don't do anything like a girl. Don't run like a girl, don't throw like a girl, don't hit like a girl, don't emote like a girl. That is not acceptable in the way that we define masculinity and the way that boys and girls police each other on how they're conforming to gender roles. And yet, romantic relationships are all about feelings, right? That's kind of the point, isn't it? You love someone, or maybe you just like them. Don't go too far on that yet. Emotions are at the center of these relationships that most boys have. Feelings, particularly feelings of attachment, feelings of liking someone like you never have before, feelings of loving someone, are among the most common reasons that boys give when we ask them, why are you dating someone? Or why are you being sexual with someone? And we have this cultural trope that having sex with someone is one of the ways you express your love for that person. It is, in many ways, very much about feelings. But again, not so much what we've given boys in their toolbox. We have encouraged them in many, many ways to not show emotions, to think that they don't have emotions. We often don't teach them how to cope with their feelings, except by getting angry, because being angry is the one feeling that we're pretty clear boys and men can have. Lust, also acceptable in there. But we can do a better job. We do it for girls. We know how to do this. We can help boys identify their feelings, differentiate between, doesn't even need to be liking and loving, between happy and ecstatic and content, or we could go with more male typical language of being kind of sad or very sad. We don't even need to give them all of those different flavors of emotional words. But we can teach them to do this. More tools for their toolbox. And we can help them understand the role of emotion and emotion as motive for other behavior. And especially things other than revenge, which they get plenty of in the action movies. Moving on now to consent. Yes. Yes is really what it's all about, right? It's a great word in slow motion there. It's very exciting. We have shifted, as some of you, perhaps all of you know, we have shifted in the last 5, maybe 10 years in our discussions of consent to yes means yes. We want active consent. The state of California has gone so far as to specify that this is the expectation when it comes to issues of sexual assault and rape, that they are looking for active consent. And that is certainly an important thing to teach our boys and our girls, regardless of whether their partners are boys or girls. We have mostly shifted away from no means no, also an important lesson. But we haven't really done a good job of teaching boys how to handle it when they say no, or when they hear no, excuse me. Given our cultural history, our cultural legacy, we put the onus on boys, at least in heterosexual couples, to initiate. It is their job to ask for the first date. It is their job to ask for the first kiss. It is their job to kind of push the bounds for other kinds of sexual contact. Certainly in male-male relationships, it's going to be on a guy because there's only guys there. When a guy asks a girl or asks a guy out on a date, especially a first date, no is an incredibly scary possibility. When you think about all of the other times that guys hear no, this one is completely different. If you try out for a team or you try out for the band and you don't make it, like, all right, that's disappointing, but maybe someone else really is better. I'm used to being ranked on skill and who's better. Maybe I just had a bad day. I woke up late or I was sick or whatever. All right, it happens. I'm used to that. But when a teenage boy asks another teen out on a date and they hear no, that no is all about them. It's not about someone else is better. It's not about I had a bad day. It's about I am somehow not good enough. That's an experience that most boys don't have any, or that event is an experience most boys don't have any sense of how to cope with. It can be crushing. It takes Harry Potter a book and a half to ask out Cho Chang after he has already defeated Voldemort like 4 times. What does that say about how difficult this is, even though it's fiction? We must do a better job of teaching boys how to handle that rejection and really understand the level of rejection that's going on there, because they don't get it. And until they've had that experience a few times as teenagers, they've really never had anything like that. We also need to teach them how to accept no when no leads to the friend zone. Also a new word in our lexicon here. The disappointment is still there. The rejection is still there. And we need to help boys think through what are the costs and what are the benefits of saying, yes, okay, I will be your friend. And then actually acting on that and choosing to stay somebody's friend after they have turned you down like this. We need to help boys. We can ask boys questions like, are you going to get sad or are you going to get mad every time you're hanging out with this person that you want to date who is your friend? Are you going to get sad or mad or jealous when they start talking about the person they are dating, when you see those messages on social media? Because we don't typically teach boys to anticipate feelings and how they're going to respond when they have those feelings. It is not in our lexicon, if you will. It is something, again, that we are more used to doing for girls. But we can do this for boys, too. If you look online, there's an incredible amount of pixels that are dedicated to the friend zone. And it's very clear that guys don't know how to deal when you start reading those posts and seeing what's written there. But we can help them figure this out, and we can help them make choices. We can remind them or direct them that they do not need to stay in the friend zone. That if you ask someone out and they say, no, but I like you as just a friend, you can actually say, no, I don't want to do that. Because they don't necessarily know that. At the extreme, we get folks like the Isla Vista shooter from 2 years ago, Elliot Rodger, who couldn't figure this out and couldn't figure this out and couldn't figure this out, and finally decided that he was going to go kill a bunch of women who should have at least had sex with him beforehand so he wouldn't have to do this. It is a very extreme case, but you can catch those themes in some of his YouTube rant and his writing. We also need to teach boys more about consent. I'm looking around and I can tell you all recognize the movie Grease. Grease, incidentally, is consistently among the 3 most frequently produced musicals by middle and high school students. Odds are at least one of you in this room has seen this at your school in the last few years. There is this scene, horrifying now. Danny takes Sandy to the drive-in, and Danny, with no consent, puts his arm around Sandy. He doesn't ask. Sandy does not respond verbally. Sandy snuggles in. So we have this whole conversation starting now, but it's all nonverbal. I'm particularly fond of this shot. Danny's hand starts to shift. He's going for her breast, a little touching there. She's a little dubious about this. You can see that on her face. She brushes his hand back. So again, we have a nonverbal request and a nonverbal response. This is not good enough for Danny, who then pretty much jumps on her in what we would today see as sexual assault. She fights him off, gets out of the car, throws his ring at him, breaks up with him, tells him what a jerk he is, and he is left alone at the drive-in. A fate worse than death. Yes means yes and no means no are both very good, very important. And we as a species are very good verbally. But when we only talk about consent as a verbal procedure, we are missing a whole segment of how it works in real life. In real life, we know there is a lot of nonverbal consent. And especially for today's teens, or a couple today, who have been together for a while and who are in the making out stage, where those hands go and where they don't go is often a nonverbal communication. It is much less likely to be a verbal communication with forethought and prior planning. We need to help our teens, particularly our boys, understand nonverbal consent, both in terms of asking and receiving an answer. And we need to tell them that if you're not clear what the answer is, then use your verbals. Don't keep asking non-verbally. I'm partial to the idea that you can ask a question twice, once non-verbally and then the second time verbally. And after that, you're starting to nag, and nobody likes a nag, especially when it comes to being sexual. We also need to teach boys about another form of no. And this dynamic really comes out of kind of traditional gender roles. Boy says something to girl like, hey, let's have sex. And girl says, well, this isn't really a good time right now. And what if someone walks in on us and I don't have any protection? You'll notice that the girl does not say either yes or no. She comes up with this list of other things. You all in this room probably understand that the girl is really trying to say no here, even though she doesn't seem to be able to form that word directly in response. There are a variety of reasons why girls do this, or why a boy might do this. And one of those is about believing that it is rude or somehow inappropriate to directly refuse a request from your partner. It is more important to be nice in a relationship than it is to necessarily express your desire or your lack of desire for a particular behavior. For the boy, though, and especially given that this tends to happen in gender-typical couples, where they both tend to adhere to the stereotypes and to our common cultural issues, he hasn't heard the word no. What he has heard is a list of problems to be solved. And we train boys from a very early age to solve problems. Doesn't matter if it's about making the electronics all play nicely with each other, beating his own defense, getting to the next level of Halo. It's all about solving problems. So, okay, when would be a good time? We can lock the door. I have a condom. Let's go, baby. Problem solved. Without knowing and understanding the subtext, and we can certainly teach subtext, this conversation goes bad really quickly. Both people get frustrated and angry. Maybe there's an argument. Maybe something else for the relationship happens. Maybe we get to a place where one of them, stereotypically the girl, gives in because it is more important to maintain the relationship and kind of suffer that thing than to say no, although we know that guys make that choice as well. Perhaps like Sandy and Danny, we're back to him jumping on her, and now we're talking about sexual assault or rape, because even though they're both in English here, they're not really speaking the same language. But we can teach subtext. We can help boys understand this kind of stuff. We can also help boys understand power dynamics. Boys, in many ways, are very good at understanding power dynamics. A lot of the groups they are in are arranged on a strict hierarchy that is really about skill, and with greater skill comes greater authority and greater power. But they go into romantic relationships. They may assume that they have the power because in a male-female couple, They believe that the guy should be in charge, period, end of conversation. And so they think they have all the power, or they assume that they have all the power, and they're not necessarily attentive to ways and places in which the girl has the power. Or maybe they come into a relationship thinking that we're equals, and there is no power dynamic, because we're equals. When the reality is, of course there are power dynamics. You're just sharing power, but it's not like you share power in every given moment of every given conversation or interaction. And so we can help boys understand power dynamics in a different way. Power when it is not strict hierarchy. Power when there are only two of you and you both have the option to leave this relationship at any time. Because that is not a model that boys see. And it's not in ESPN or Sports Illustrated or any of their TV. And they don't hear it, and they don't have good models. And it's not in that 10-minute talk that they may or may not have had with their parents. So in their toolbox here regarding consent, we need some greater conversation about what consent looks like. We need more details about nonverbals and about subtext. Again, giving them a more complex, more nuanced, more detailed understanding. And we also need to have some real discussions about equality and power dynamics. Because it's not enough to say you should both have equal power. They don't really understand or know what that looks like or how that works. And then finally, we need to make sure that everyone understands that guys can say no, even if it's kind of hard to imagine. I don't think that guy ever really says no thanks to some kind of sexual activity. But the fact that you have both an X and a Y chromosome does not preclude a guy from saying no. Guys say no to all sorts of other things in their life. No, I don't want to hang out right now. No, I don't want to play Madden. I'd rather play Dota. Oh, sorry, I didn't see that high five. No, I'm not going to answer your text right now. Guys refuse stuff all the time. And they understand that they have some volition there. But when it comes to sexual activity, we are so stuck in this image, this Casanova complex that we have created over the last few decades, that we have left out the possibility that a guy would say no. And we can teach everyone that guys have as much right to say no as do girls. We are starting to see this in the press. The last year, 2 years, the press has become much better about using the term rape when it's a male victim. We almost always hear about this in terms of a teacher-student relationship. 2 headlines there that I pulled off the internet. The articles don't always follow through. There was a New York Post article from September, beginning of this school year, which talked about the rape of a high school student by 2 of his teachers, and then in paragraph 1 talked about it as a sex romp. Okay. The headlines have gotten there. We've gotten through to the editors at least, because the editors control the headlines. We haven't gotten all the way through to the journalists. Much like 20 and 30 years ago, we hadn't gotten through to the journalists when it was a female victim. But we are seeing progress. The headlines now, at least, universally, or almost universally, use the word rape. At least when it's this kind of clear teacher-student dynamic and there are charges filed in court. We don't always get that in other situations where it's sexual assault. The big deal from the beginning of this school year in Sayreville, New Jersey, where some members of the football team, or wannabe members of the football team, came forward to say that their teammates hazed them by threatening to penetrate them anally. This case was not a big deal until the principal canceled the football season, at which point it became national news. It was news because the football season got canceled, not because some boys got sexually assaulted. It's a high school. Everybody knows everybody. Not that hard to figure out who are the new guys on the football team. Once this became national news, those guys who had reported that they were threatened with sexual assault started to get death threats. Not the perpetrators, not our juniors and seniors, our upstanding citizens on the football team, but their potential victims got threatened. And nowhere in this story, as national news, did it get discussed as possible rape. There were a few places where it started to creep in as sexual assault by week 2 of the story, but early on it was just hazing, but a very particular form of hazing. Because we don't talk about male victims. And yet we know there are a lot of male victims. Estimates say upwards of 1 in 6 men will be sexually assaulted or raped at some point in their lifetime. A recent study by researcher Brianna French put the number at 40% of teenage boys and college-aged men who report that they had been pressured. Now, pressure is not the same as assault. They had been pressured into doing something sexual. 20% of the guys, half of the guys who had been pressured, said that they had intercourse with someone because they had been pressured to do it. Back to people being sexual in order to maintain some kind of relationship, but not because they want to be sexual. So we hear these kinds of stats. We know that the effects for male victims are really the same as the effects for female victims: high levels of depression, feelings of worthlessness, loss of energy, high levels of anxiety and anxiety-type disorders like PTSD, potentially some hypervigilance, depending on some of the details of the case, potentially some suicidal thoughts or some attempts at suicide. We also know that it is harder in some ways for boys and men to admit that they have been a sexual victim than it is for girls and women. Again, there is no larger scale cultural dialogue that they can tap into, because our stereotype tells us that boys and men always want sex, which precludes the possibility that they could ever be forced. The FBI didn't track cases where males were forced to penetrate someone until about 3 years ago. They finally changed the definition. Prior to that, the FBI really didn't see raping of males as a possibility unless we're talking about a situation like Andy Dufresne in the Shawshank Redemption, where he's being actively forced. Wasn't on our radar. We didn't have statistics. We didn't have, and still really don't have, any kind of larger cultural dialogue that guys can tap into. One organizational report from Male Survivor says that the average, according to the folks who use Male Survivor's resources, the average length of time from first experience of being sexually assaulted or raped to disclosing that, at least among the adult men who used that particular provider, was 20 years. So they're going through their entire, if this has happened to them as child or teen, they're going through their entire teen years and much of their young adulthood not telling anyone. So we can give them some resources, some of the organizations that you can access online and by phone, on screen. RAIN in particular, and in cooperation with the other organizations, offers an 800 number, which I apparently failed to put on screen, but you can find RAIN easy enough online. Part of the toolbox that we need to give boys includes their ability to say no, and helping them figure out why and when they would want to say no, what it might cost them in terms of personal ego, in terms of social status, because we know, again, that they are oriented towards social status in some ways, and what they can do and where they can get resources if they feel that they have been pressured into sexual activity that they did not really agree with, or assaulted or raped. And if we're doing all of these things, talking to boys about relationship dynamics, talking to boys about their feelings, and particularly their feelings as motives for other behaviors, talking to boys about consent, talking to boys about boys having the ability to say no, then we will give them a much more full, much more complete toolbox. And that in turn should help make them sexually healthier and allow them to have healthier relationships with girls or boys as they prefer. Thank you.